everybody, and thank you for inviting me to be here today. With such great speakers as well, and it's fantastic. And we were just saying in the break, and actually before that it's so great to have us all together when we're really on the same wavelength, and lots of weaving together of ideas from us all. So it's a really interesting day for me to be able to see the other speakers too. So thank you very much for this opportunity. It's been great. So I'll just say a bit about myself first, and probably the first thing I want to say is that the airline lost my luggage on the way over here. So if you could just imagine me in a black dress, about past my knees, shoulders here, looking very smart, okay? That would be wonderful, thank you very much. Second thing is to say that, so I moved back to Swansea University February this year. Started off in Swansea University as well, actually, in the early childhood studies that was there. I did my undergraduate degree there a very long time ago. But before that, I was an early childhood practitioner for a few years as well. Had my own children and decided I wanted to learn more about the theories, and particularly around play I was very interested in. And so I went to university again, did my undergraduate degree, and have to say to Alison, which I have already, that I did the mosaic approach as my dissertation in third year, and it really opened my eyes to what you could learn from children if you actually just listened to them. And that then took me on to do my PhD and all the research and work that I do now, so thank you very much, Alison, for that. And what I did notice when I was doing the mosaic approach was that children were constantly, as I think you said before, looking at peers, really everything was about their peers and about friendships. And it made me start to think about the social relationships, how absolutely crucial and important they are, not only for us now as adults, but starting very, very young from early childhood. And so that's when I started to look at conversation analysis then, as I'll talk a little bit about. So today I'm going to be talking about stories about children's competencies. So the reason why I moved to New Zealand 8 years ago after getting my PhD was because I was very interested in their early childhood framework that they've got there, Whāriki, which actually means a weaving, and I'll show you a slide on that in a minute. But it really talks to the co-construction of knowledge and ideas, and that's really the basis of the early childhood curriculum in New Zealand. And I really wanted to learn more about how that's actually practically implemented in everyday life. Because we can talk about it as a theory, and we all agree it's really great, but how does that actually relate to practice? How are we doing that co-construction in everyday practice? And so I became a lecturer out there, and because you have to be a teacher, a qualified teacher out there to work in early childhood, we have to go out and observe the practice of early childhood teachers there, practicing early childhood teachers. So I was able to go out and see the wonderful work that was being done, the not so wonderful work as well, which you learn so much from. So, that's really good as well to observe. And then now I want to bring that back with me to Wales and hopefully start something really interesting in Swansea University around early childhood education. So that's the grand plan. Only been there a few months, going okay so far. But yeah, so it's lovely to come and talk to you today about some of the things that I learned while I was in New Zealand, and we're going to talk a bit about learning stories as documentation, but then how that can link to conversation analysis, which is my particular area of research, and as I said, we'll get on to that. So, what are learning stories? Has anybody heard of learning stories here? A couple of people. I was given a few copies of the Learning Stories book by Margaret Carr to hand out for you all to look at, but they were in my case that got lost, so I'm so sorry about that. But basically, so it's a formative assessment for children, for very young children. It goes from 0 to probably we'll say 5 years when they start school, because it does seem to drop off a little bit then when they get into school, primary school. And what we're interested in particularly is looking at children's strengths. So it's a credit-based document. It documents learning moments that have happened for the child in their everyday life in the early childhood centres. And so when we're thinking about sort of learning in that perspective of what we see as learning, that can be very interesting when we're considering learning stories. So the writing of a learning story can either be instigated by the teacher or the child, which I think is one of the real strengths of the assessment. So, for example, I'll show you an example of one in a little while. If a child is doing something, say they're taking their first steps or something like that, you can document that. You can actually see it's a physical progression of something that they haven't done before. But also a child, like in the example I'll show you, can also come to a teacher and say, can you put this in my learning storybook, please? Because they felt like they've really progressed, or they want this particular episode documented for future reference, which I think is really, really great. So they have autonomy, and that's a very empowering thing for children as well, to be able to say that to a teacher and to know that that's actually going to be documented for them in that learning stories book. So it's a relatively short story. There's no particular length on it. Some of them can be just a couple of paragraphs, some of them can be a couple of pages. The early childhood teacher will write it, but they'll write it with the child, just to make sure that they've got the story right, to make sure that that is actually documented correctly by the teacher. They don't just say, yes, I'll write that now, go off to the office, write it themselves, and then, hey, press it as a story. It is an actual collaborative and co-constructed partnership for writing that documentation. Often there's a photograph with the learning, so that they can actually see it as a picture book when they go back and revisit it. And it's a nice moment to catch. So you talk about multimodal ways of documenting learning episodes. You can have stories. I'm waiting for when there starts video recordings and those sorts of things, as we advance in digital technology, in early childhood particularly. But at the moment it tends to be a photograph with some writing around that. And as I say, co-created by the teacher and the child. Very importantly, whānau or family are invited to comment on those learning stories as well. So there's always a space at the bottom for families to be able to talk about that learning and say really nice positive things about that child. So it's written to the child. I think you were fantastic today when you did this. And then there's a space at the bottom then for the families to have a look at and to comment as well themselves. So it really is a collaborative process, a collaborative documentation of a learning. And also, it is the formal assessment of early childhood education in New Zealand. So it works within the Te Whare Key framework, which is this, if you haven't seen it before. So Te Whare Key in Te Reo Māori actually means a woven mat. And it's for these principles and the strands to form a standing point for the learning to actually come from, to grow from. But as you can imagine, things like so the principles, family and community, relationships, holistic development, empowerment, when we think about that and how we're actually implementing that in practice, it can actually be a little bit tricky. So how do you know you're supporting belonging, for example, in your everyday practice with every child that you're with? So it can be a little bit tricky, and that's what's been really interesting to research around. I think this is a really great framework. I think it's wonderful because it's holistic, and it takes in the perspectives of the children and the family, and I think it works really, really well. And I think lots of other countries are actually learning from this and building their own curriculum from this too, which is very exciting. And the philosophy behind it, so Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory, where the child is at the centre, but is impacted on from all the other forces outside, but also impact on the other forces from the outside. Learning stories were developed by Margaret Carr and Wendy Lee at Waikato University, and I was very, very pleased to be able to work at Waikato University for those 8 years with Margaret, and also getting to know Wendy really well, and that's where Te Whare Key was born. It was created in '97, and so all the people that had created that curricula were still available and still around, which has just been the most fantastic experience there. So guided by Bronfenbrenner, but all the principles that Alison was talking about today also absolutely are embedded within that curricula for early childhood practice in New Zealand. Which is why it's really great for us to be able to come and talk together. We're all sort of thinking about the same principles in our work. So with the child at the centre, we see the child as competent and capable in their everyday learning and their everyday activities, and that they are citizens. They are actually active citizens within the world of learning, within society. And so, because we had that framework developed with Fariki and all these principles behind it, they needed to develop a documentation that was actually going to reflect that too. They didn't want a top-down checklist of developmental things that children could do. They wanted something that was going to actually support this holistic principle that we had thought about for early childhood education. And so we're hoping they're empowering for children, and we can see that they are, because when you're reading the stories, children coming to you and actually asking to put their stories in documentation and having them documented there, but also the empowerment that is supported by teachers in everyday practice, by encouraging children to be independent. Credit-based documentation, as I said, in the formative assessment, and that co-authoring of the learning stories with children. So I'm not sure if you can read it, hopefully you can, but this is just one of the examples of a learning story. And you can see it's just a nice small one. This has come from the exemplars that are written around supporting teachers to be able to document their children's learning. And on that website there, you'll see lots of different books. So I think there's about 20 different books altogether, 18, 20 different books, which talk about different things. So it could be like maths or literacy or something like that, but how it's actually embedded in a very holistic kind of way, how learning might be represented holistically. So here is an example of who's asked the teacher to write about his moves, because he's dancing to a particular tune, and he's going really fast when the music speeds up, and he's going really slow when the music slows down. And he thinks that this is some significant thing that's happening for him at that particular moment that he wants documented. And so he approaches the teacher and comes and asks her to document this. And I think what's really nice in the exemplars is that how might this document assessment contribute to developing empowerment. So if you're looking at empowerment, you can look at these stories, these examples of stories, and see actually how is this supporting Lachlan's particular empowerment, and how could that perhaps be represented in my own everyday practice with children. So these are really, really useful for beginning teachers, but also for teachers who are there. So every year the Children's Centre has a pack of these exemplars. They're now online, and they've stopped publishing them, unfortunately, because you can get them online. And I'm not sure how I feel about that. I think I perhaps feel a bit negatively about that. Because to get something to hand, or to have something just there that you can see, is very, very different to knowing it's in the cupboard somewhere that you click onto it. You know, it's a very different kind of thing. And I think this is the same, Will and I discussed this about the documentation with these learning stories. So you can see here how it's written out, and then we'd have the bit at the bottom where the parents contribute to that. It's put together in a book. The books are put on the shelves at the level that the children can reach, so that they can pick it up and they can review it any time. They sit with the teacher and they flick through the book and they look at it, and they look at the progression of learning that they've had. Sometimes over years, if they've been in the same centre, they take the books with them if they move centres. So they've got this documentation right to hand that they can sit down with teachers. Now the worry is, with this wonderful new digital age, things are slowly starting to change, and private companies are actually selling software packages to early childhood centres, where they say all you need to do is you upload a picture onto this particular space, and you can just write a little bit. You don't have to write very much. You can write 2 sentences if you like. Okay, about what's learning this happened there today. And then there's little boxes for you. So the boxes are well-being, holistic development, empowerment, belonging, and so on. Okay? So what you've got is a photograph, 2 sentences, and then I think it's empowerment, so I'll click that and the little box at the end, that's empowerment. And that's it. One of the good things about it is that you can share that internationally because it's accessible by different family members all over the world. But can you see the problems that that might actually have? And these are growing. This idea of doing or documenting learning is actually growing like that, which is a real worry. And as Mara said, which really struck me, is that idea of having a really robust assessment in this kind of holistic, credit-based way. Because if we don't have that, we're absolutely leaving the gates open for people to come in and go, actually this isn't documenting learning very well at all. So what we're going to give you is a tick chart thing, and you can assess them and they can do tests and that sort of thing. Absolutely, that will happen if we don't make really robust learning stories. This is a smaller one of a learning story. There are much longer ones. Depends on what the teacher and the child want to document at the time. And so it's really inductive, which is one of the really good points about it. So I think that's a point that I would like to consider today, and I think that we should all really consider today, because it is really crucial to documentation in a very credit-based, holistic way. So, when I'm thinking about the questions that we're going to give specific questions, we're very like, I can answer some of those, I can sort of do more generally, and I can answer some more specifically. So this particular question, I think, so to make it very specific to children, learning stories documentation has been developed to accommodate all children living in New Zealand. And now, over the last, probably not very long actually, probably the last 5 years or so, there's been a real change in the social and economic situations of people and children in New Zealand, where there are starting to be really scary divides in rich and poor. And I don't know if you've heard on the news or not about the average house price in Auckland is now $1 million. And this is for, we're not talking any kind of flash house, we're talking about a wooden, sort of like a mobile structure, really, that's just in a couple of bedrooms. And the trouble with the wooden houses is they get very damp. And so then you get all sorts of chest problems and that sort of thing. So if you're having to live in very cheap housing, it has all kinds of implications for health as well. And so what we try to do is to encourage children to come into early childhood services where there are nice, healthy, hopefully, rooms, and also you get the nice living environment, and of course families are also absolutely welcome there in early childhood centres as well. And so documentation-wise, this can span across all sorts of different social economic situations. Of course, it depends on the teacher education as well as to how much they're aware and how much they know about implementing things like belonging and well-being. And so that's also taught then at degree level in universities, how to do learning stories, and they practice them, and we look at the exemplars together and these sorts of things. And what I really liked about it, and what I really like about the whole New Zealand context, with regard to documentation but other things as well, is that it's a very inductive approach to early childhood education, which is what I'm really interested in. So rather than going in with predefined ideas about what's happening, we're looking at what's happening from the grassroots up, to learn from what's happening in practice from teachers. So we're learning from teacher practice absolutely all the time, but also to learn from children, of course, about how they're co-constructing all sorts of things with peers and with adults as well. So it's a really nice inductive approach. We're seeing what's happening, and then we're analysing that and working out how can we make that better. Did we learn a lot from things that went wrong, for example, those sorts of things. And that then would link to conversation analysis, which I'll go into. And of course you can write learning stories about children from birth through to 7 years old. What we're trying to do is to encourage primary schools more to take the books on board when the children start at primary school, so that we've got that smoother transition, because that's always an issue with documentation in early childhood. Is that followed through when they start school? And often it isn't. It's a very tricky sort of agenda. So what we would really like, and what this seems like a very sensible thing to do and very practical, is that all the learning stories books that children have accumulated over the years that they've been in early childhood take those into primary school, they can read them to their peers, they're available as they were in early childhood, but also then they can build on those. So what are they learning at primary school? Can we document that learning? Maybe can we creep it into the first year of primary and then, you know, maybe go a little bit further as we get on. Instead of having this very top-down social construction of learning, which we often have from universities, so we need to do A-levels, to do A-levels we need to do GCSEs, we need to be able to pass primary school, you know, all that real top-down structure. We're trying to go the other way, push the other way out. Children's holistic development is really important, and Margaret Carr talks a lot about children's dispositions to learn. And so when they're encouraged to learn, when they see themselves as capable and competent members of society, they carry that thriving want to learn through all the different years of them, and in different contexts and different situations. And that's really what we're trying to tell those about. And there's always a bit of a clash. Like, to be honest, I think there probably always will be, but the hope is that we can move a little bit differently in the future. And it is changing a little bit. Some primary schools are taking these things on board, which is great. So another question that I can answer there then directly. The difference between teacher agenda and child's agenda. Well, I think in early childhood we're looking at it together. So we're looking at learning together. The teacher's interested in the learning of the child, and the child also wants to document their learning too. And as I said before, that co-construction of the writing of the learning stories, that sort of evens things out a little bit, I think, with power relations between teachers and children. But also then bringing in learning storybooks, Farno, to have a look at those learning storybooks and to document their own opinions or their own ideas around what children are doing. So it brings them in a little bit more because family is so important to work with. So stories about the success of the children. So we're going from, that's really great, what can you do now? So they look at a particular story of learning. Right, so how are you doing with this now? And they will say, well, they're now practicing this, and I've got this really good example next, which I'll show you about that. And then children setting their own goals and agendas from that, which I'll show you now. So this footage is from a learning stories project that I did with Margaret Carr. It was a 3-year funded project from the New Zealand government around children's early literacy. And we'd written the application as, you know, we'll look at literacy and learning and these sorts of technical words that the government like to hear, but with a very holistic kind of agenda. And so it was a very interesting project. And as I say, absolutely wonderful to work with Margaret. Also worked with Alex Gunn and Elaine Rees from Canterbury University. I'll talk a little bit more about the project later. I just want for now to show you, this is one of the examples of what a learning story might look like. So the learning stories are out, and you'll see, I don't know if you can see properly, but the yellow folders here, those are all the children's learning stories, so they have access to them. And one of the children who was cuddled up there, Welsh word, cuddled up there with one of the teachers, she's taken her book and she's sitting down with and she's looking through a learning story book with her, which then encouraged the other little girl on the side to go and get her story. And it tends to happen like that. So all of a sudden you have lots of children sitting there looking at their learning story books together. So I just wanted to show you this little clip. First of all, she's turned to a page where she's looking at the monkey bars. One thing to say is, do you know what monkey bars are? Yes? The ones that you'll see in the picture now. Metal frame with little bars spaced like this, and they have to swing and try and grab. Yep. This is inductive research, as I said, so I'm trying to be a fly on the wall here with the video camera. And what I tend to do is I have a Bluetooth wireless mic that the teacher will wear, or the child, depending on who's the participant. Here the teacher's wearing it, and I try to hang back as much as I possibly can out of the way. So the little girl stands in the way a little bit and all these sorts of things, but that's how it is in the video data. So just to warn you about this stuff.
Practicing the monkey bars. My goodness, you worked really hard, Madeline.
I skipped the bar.
Because you practiced and now you can go all the way along.
And I skipped the bar.
And you skipped the bar. That's very tricky.
Did you know Sometimes I do like finish and jump off the blue box.
Do you? Do a grand landing. What else are you practicing on the monkey bars
I'm
now?
trying to skip 2 bars at the same time.
You're trying to skip 2, so now you can do 1, and you're trying to go to that one.
Yeah,
Is that what you're practicing? That's a good plan to have, Madeline. Madeline, could you hang upside down then, or were you just practicing? Because I see that you can hang upside down now. You were doing that today, outside. That's really good. So from here, from practicing, you can do it. Is there any pictures of you hanging upside down in here? We might need to take some. Might we? Let's have a look. There isn't any.
We still have to get lots more.
We do still need to get lots more. There's still lots of spare pages.
Okay, so one of the first things to notice is how that situation is managed. So you are wanting to sit down, or a child is particularly wanting to sit down with you to review, because this is one of the really important things, to review their learning. And then other children want to come into that situation as well, so how that's managed. So things like a sensible contribution, like when I was doing monkey bars, blah, 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 that's picked up on by the teacher. What isn't picked up on by the teacher is when she's saying silly, silly, okay? I think that's really, really interesting for one point, and that's a conversation analysis thing that we won't get into right now. But the other thing is how that book is reviewed. So the learning processes in New Zealand are notice, recognise, respond. This is what the teachers are taught undergraduate level. You notice some sort of learning or something significant that's happened for the child, or the child will obviously call you because there's something going on. You recognise it as a possible learning situation or a learning moment, and you record it, so that's in your documentation. So notice, recognise, record. Then after this went on for a little while, they thought, actually, the thing that's missing here is the review part of it. So reviewing that piece of documentation as well is just as important as the documentation itself. And as you can see here, this is absolutely a progression of learning. So you've got the documented learning, what she can do, she did the monkey bars, a goal. So now she wants to be able to skip 2 bars at a time. She hadn't quite got to that when I was there. But also hanging upside down. That's a new thing that she can do, okay?
Practicing.
So then, after that story was written, that was talked to, he ran outside straight away, ran to the monkey bars and immediately hung upside down for Kim to take a picture of her. Because they'd just been talking about that documentation process. Well, they didn't have a picture of her hanging upside down. So this now goes into the documentation book with a story around, this was one of the goals that you were looking at. You wanted me to take a picture of you hanging upside down because now you can do this. Perhaps we'll go back to that goal then of skipping 2 bars because she wasn't quite there yet. And so you've got the children actually setting their agenda for learning here, setting their own goals for learning, which I just find fascinating and I think is really good way forward. So, going into conversation analysis, so one way to look more closely at the co-construction of learning is through the use of conversation analysis. So has anybody heard of conversation analysis in there? Yeah. So it was created by Harvey Sachs, Gail Jefferson, and Manuel Shegloff in UCLA probably about 50 years ago. I think we had the 50th anniversary of the last thing, so 54 years maybe, something like that. So it's quite new relatively to lots of other research methods. But what it does, and the first recordings really of the way that CA was created was that Harvey Sachs was interested in the co-construction of social context, but he was looking at suicide lines and how, well, reasons that the callers gave for phoning in, the problems that they elicited, and then how those problems then were handled by the call taker. And this kind of work is still going on now, and it's really effective around helping people in very difficult situations. There's lots of work around children's call lines now with conversation analysis, how we can keep them on the phone a little bit longer, how we can find out what's actually going on here. And lots of people doing lots of detailed transcripts around those phone calls to try and help those sorts of situations. There's also conversation analysis done around driving instructions and all sorts of different instructions now as well, which is really interesting. But here today, we're particularly interested in children interaction and co-construction of social interactions. So we look at video and audio recordings. Video for young children is best because there's lots of gesture and the non-verbal is really, really important, particularly with the younger children. So we try to get video recording as much as we can. And like I say, we try to stay away as much as we possibly can. So you have to go in as a researcher, explaining to the teachers, I'm not here as a member of staff now. I'm here as a fly on the wall. Do what you do. Obviously, there's going to be some sort of swaying of the results you get there because teachers want to look great. But interestingly, because I've worked with a particular group of teachers for a long time, probably about 7 or 8 years now, they trust me now. And so when I'm videoing them, they can relax. They know that they can just do what they do. And then we go in, we look at the video recordings together, and we analyse it together. And so this was really great. What can we learn from this particular situation as well? So I think that's a big part of that kind of research method. Assumptions cannot be made about why people are doing things. So you write up the transcript, and I'll show you an example in a minute, of the interaction. Assumptions cannot be made. So when we're thinking about documentation, you just write what was said and done between the participants as you're transcribing the interaction. So that kind of eliminates a little bit of your own agenda, but of course, not all of it. As we said before, you can never actually be completely, can't put your opinion into that. So we transcribe the interaction, and as we're transcribing, because we do it in such a detailed way, we really learn about things that are happening within that interaction. So we look at things like pauses are always really interesting. What happened before the pause, after the pause? It's in hundredths of a second. You know, it's really, really detailed stuff, but you get so much from small excerpts of interaction from it. And so we look at what participants are orienting to themselves, so what are children actually orienting to, and how are they orienting to that? How are they talking to other people while they're orienting to particular things? And it does help to offer a reliable and valid account of the social organisation process because you're documenting exactly what's happened when you're doing the transcript. And here's a bit of an example of that transcription. So just from a few seconds. And I'll play the video now so you can see. So documented the pause time, overlaps. So you've got these here which mark an overlap in talk, the seconds. The money shot is a smiley voice, so if they're smiling when they're talking, you've got the dollar sign. Question mark is a slowly rised intonation at the end of the sentence or the talk. So I'll just play that and you can see. This is from the footage that I'm going to be playing tomorrow.
What was it, sorry? So why do you think that now there's no water when before there was water?
It's dry.
Yeah, it is dried out, isn't it?
Okay, so just from a few seconds we can really break down what's happened. So we've got the child eliciting the conversation. So he initiates the topic of conversation. So they're outside in the rural bushland. It's a protected bush reserve in New Zealand. Teacher doesn't hear, so she does that with what we call a pair. Sorry, what was that? And the girl kind of overlap together and it's very messy. But the teacher doesn't give an answer straight away. She, like we said before, she prompts, what do you think? Why do you think that might have happened? So whereas we can kind of think, yeah, that's a really good thing to do, so we'll all do that, you ask their opinion. What does that actually look like in everyday practice? And this can really show you that, okay? So the teacher says this, that we that we say is a really good idea. Why do you think that's happening, Mrs. Porter? And there's a big pause then, 2 seconds, over 2 seconds, and the girl says, it's dry, yeah, it's dry enough. This then leads on to a whole conversation for a very long time about why it might have dried up. And so I'll be talking about that a little bit more tomorrow when we think about teacher responses to children's interactions and things, which we'll get on to later. But that's just to give you a bit of an idea of what conversation is. So the next project, Pedagogical Subjectivity. So this was, like I said, just wanted to find out the interactions that were going on between teachers and children. It says 66 children here. This is the problem when you're recording teachers, that you don't know which child is going to come up and talk to them because it's inductive research. So we had to get consent for every child there to be on video. Your child may be captured in this video recording. You know, if you mind, can you talk to me and we'll sort them out. So actually, it didn't actually involve 66 children. It was just the children who actually approached the teachers then. So I went out into the bushland with them, about 10 hours of footage, all absolutely inductive, just recording what was going on there at the time. And then transcribed using the conversation analysis transcription conventions that I just showed you about those intonations and things like that. And one of the things that was interesting was the morality, and I found this quite interesting because when we're talking about co-construction, that when we're talking about play, lots of learning around play, but actually what are children interested in learning themselves through play? And through the footage I found that there was this underlying idea of morality. So when they approached the bush, which I'll show you now, they had to say a promise, the marigold of the forest, Tanya Maguta. And then there's an interesting way of how children actually get out of breaking that promise, which I'll show you now. So here's a transcription of when they're approaching the forest and they have to say approaching the forest and have to say the promise.
Okay. I think the word. I just want to explain to you. So we are on the before going to most likely, we have some more. Huh? We have time of the way of the forest. Permission to enter the forest. Then do you want to tell Peter what we say? Yes, we say, I heard that there's something from the forest.
So I'm really quick because they know it already, so they just ramble through it. So this was very interesting to me. So the positioning of where they are, first of all, before they actually go into the forest, they have to make this promise. They're not actually allowed into the forest until they've made this promise. So I have some other video footage of them trying to coax these words out of the children to make this promise before they go in. But really interestingly, how the children then kind of try and avoid this. The first thing he does as he approaches the teacher of the child is he says, I'm a possum. And then he picks up some leaves and shrubs and things and throws them into the forest. I don't know if you know about possums in New Zealand, but they have a very, very bad reputation for being really destructive to the forest land. And they do absolutely everything they can to try and get rid of possums, okay? So it's no mistake that the child has actually used this identity before he picks up the foliage and then throws it in. But there's some really interesting membership categorization work that's happening here. So I'll play you the clip and then I'll show you the transcript.
Well, I'm not possum. Well, I'm not going that far.
Trevor, we
I'm
promised.
not going.
You promised Tanya Mahuti you weren't going to hurt these things, and throwing branches is not being respectful.
Well, I'm not going to fight it either.
That's
Not
good.
because I'm not going to break my promise.
I know you're being a possum, and that is the sort of thing the possums do. But you did promise Tanya that you wouldn't hurt it. Well, that's a dead branch on the ground. That's okay.
That's okay, it's dead branch, it's fine. Okay, so really interesting stuff going on just in those little minutes or so of that interaction, and there's the transcript there. So the notion that he actually declares that he's a possum before he actually does anything kind of eliminates anything that he can be told off on that. Okay? So he made the promise, but kind of made the promise. Yeah. The possum didn't make the promise. The possum is a very destructive creature that by its own nature they're unhealthy, you know, they can't help it, they've got to throw stuff in the room, because that's just what they do, okay? So he announces that he is. And then interestingly, you've got the other child there who says, well, I'm not going that far. So immediately she's really stating her position, her social position here. She's not going to do what he's doing because, you know, she's absolutely the opposite of that. So then he throws the moves in, and then you've got the teacher telling him off a little bit. We promise, but he doesn't say don't do it. He goes straight to the promise that they've made. So they've tied themselves into this commitment of behaving in particular ways that they've stated before they go into the forest. So now he's broken that. So he says about breaking the promise, throwing the things is not being respectful. Okay? And then up comes the little girl again. Well, I'm not going to throw them in either. So she's got, again, this really polar opposite. Well, I'm not doing that. I'm not being categorised in the same category as he is because I'm the one who's being really good. I'm not throwing things in. I'm not going that far. So says, yes, that's good. And then she says about breaking the promise. So this promise keeps coming up. So this is about sort of 40 minutes into the trip. That was a while ago. And they say it really quickly because they know to do it. But it's constantly brought back on if there's something going wrong there. And then does this lovely membership categorisation work that we talk about in conversation analysis, or that can be linked to conversation analysis, that SAC's also developed. I know you're being a possum, and that's the sort of things that possums do. And so you've got these category-bound activities that possums do these kinds of things. So actually, yeah, he was right to be able to do that. But you did promise you wouldn't hurt it. So there's a real conflicting here. So when we're talking about co-construction of moral codes, we can see how this is actually played out in actual life. There's no dream scenario of things going perfectly well. There is a bit of a battle, but they're talking about promises and different creatures, different pseudonyms to be able to back up their whole point of views. So this is why I really like conversation analysis. I think this is really, really interesting stuff, and it does take a very long time to do the transcriptions and all this sort of thing, but you get so much out of it, it's great. And I know that at the end there, well, that's a dead branch, that's fine. You can do anything you like with the dead stuff, just don't kill the dead stuff. So then going on to the storytelling project, as I said, with Margaret Carr, Alex Gunn and Elaine Rees. So Alex Gunn and Elaine Rees had a cohort of children down the South Island. Margaret and I worked with children in Auckland, on the North Island, just up from where we were. 6 children in each one of the sets. And we followed them from kindergarten through to primary school, which was very, very interesting. And we had a storytelling advisory group, which is what it's called STAG groups, that involved the children, the teachers, parents, and the early childhood teachers. The primary teachers, early childhood teachers, parents, children, and then the researchers. And we had such great conversations there. And at the end of it, the primary teachers said that they didn't realise that the early childhood centres were doing so much early literacy work, which was really interesting. But the early childhood teachers also said that they didn't realise how flexible the primary school teachers were. And so it sort of made us think if we could get those two groups together somehow, that would be the best outcome for children, because you can see the similarities and what's missing, and to be able to fill those gaps when children are transitioning into school. The problem is, of course, that it's more time for teachers, both early childhood and primary teachers, to be able to, because it would have to be out of work hours where they're getting together to meet around this, and of course they're so stretched already. So there are problems around that, but ideally that would be a really great way for children to get that wonderful transition together. So one of the good ways of using conversation analysis with early childhood teachers is recording and documenting everything that's going on there in those little clips. But the way to do that is to, or that I've done, is to record and then immediately after the recording ask the teachers what significant moments they felt happened in that. Because you're recording for a blanket hour of just general sort of everyday stuff. So to get the teachers to identify moments that they felt were significant is really, really helpful and really, really productive. So get those, I got the teachers to identify what was going on, or what they thought was interesting there, went back to the office, transcribed it in that conversation analysis way, and made points as I was going through about things that I felt had happened. And then went back to the teachers when we had these meetings and said, so you pointed this particular moment out, can you tell me about why you felt that was interesting? The children have their comments on it as well, because they're there and they can remember, because they're video clips that we're showing, they can remember them. But then also to say, well, from doing my analysis, I also found this. And so then together you get these really, really great construction of what actually happened there. So one of the things in the storytelling project was storytelling shells. And these were absolutely fascinating and fabulous for storytelling activities. And it did make me think about Lego people who are here, about the use of objects. And Amelia and I had written a paper a couple of years ago about use of objects in early childhood, and what we tend to find, because we were looking around and researched where children were using objects, is that it is very developmental, how they're handling objects, the constructions they build, the cognitive functioning of using particular objects for structures and this sort of thing. Whereas what we were finding is that objects were used for social purposes, mostly. That's what children were actually using them for. So they'd approach a child and say, oh, I like your badge, and that's really lovely, and then you will immediately start up a conversation. Or they ask a question about a particular object. And so we found this really, really interesting, and something that we think could be quite useful if you're thinking about doing this sort of research around how objects are used. So for the shells, the teachers actually picked these shells up from a local beach in Auckland, and the children decided to, they get a choice of which stickers they can put on them. And you can see perhaps there's a lion over in the corner there, you've got a skull and crossbones, a fish, a cake, sandcastle, all these different kinds of things. And children can bring in stickers, and teachers bring in their own stickers as well. And you have this whole box of shells. And what's really nice is the teachers collect the children together and say, oh, look at this fantastic box. Oh, what do we think? And there's all this hype around, opening the box up and taking the shells out, and there's time taken around placing them the right way so that you can see all the pictures on the shelves, and it's just this lovely process. And it's very reassuring for the children, particularly those who are very new to storytelling the shells or trying to tell a story. Because we know that storytelling helps later literacy practice, but also storytelling is a really nice thing for children to be doing now for all sorts of reasons. So we get the beginners who might just sit and watch and not actually participate in telling a story, but they listen to the stories that are being told, and that's very significant. Then we've got ones who have been there a little bit and they want to tell a story themselves, and they might pick out a couple of shells. And we have more elaborate storytellers that might go on for a very long time, pick out numerous shells and tell huge elaborate stories around them. And one of the things that the teachers actually put into this practice was to get children to say the end. And the reason why they had to say the end was because sometimes the stories would go on and there'd be these huge pauses, but they weren't quite finished, they were just thinking of the next storyline, yeah? Bring another shell in. And then eventually they would say the end. Oh, right, great, now we can move on to the next person. But it's to give them that autonomy over their storytelling. It's lovely practices in place. So here is just a little clip of using the storytelling shells, and she's only been there for a little while and she's just starting to learn it, so it's quite quiet and a little bit slow.
You can use another shell too if you want to add to your story. What happened to the other leg?
So what I think is really interesting there is how she places the shells in a particular order. We had this idea of this linear sequence of thought represented within the storytelling shells, because they go from one to the other, and they'll place the shells in the storyline, which is really, really interesting. Then also pointing to the shells as they're telling the story shows the support that the storytelling objects can actually give to this storytelling. They can have them there to support this sort of whatever character it was, can be egg, you know, or they can go and fly on this aeroplane, but they'll use that particular shell to support that storytelling. So really, really interesting. So like I say, I'm offering characters to help prompt the storytelling or support that storytelling. But it can also be cognitively challenging because although you've got the objects there, and possibly people there, like fairies or pirates or whatever, the children have to make a connection between those two. And they have to think about that themselves. And often that's done with an action. So like we just saw, he eats the eggs. So they're connecting the shells together with their own thoughts. And that is what we thought was really interesting, the way that the shells were used and actually can stimulate and support that sort of storytelling. And then, of course, it being a co-creative process over telling. So prompts from the teacher, which often can be things like, keep going, and, you know, the sort of thing. But leaving pauses there as well, so that they've got time to be able to contribute what they want to. In that social situation of the group, the speaker speaks and the others listen. And that's a very particular kind of social setting, just like here now. But we create this ourselves. This is a co-construction of what we do here. Okay. So the speaker has the floor and the other children, the other participants listen.
Is there any kind of criteria for what goes on the shells?
No,
Or it can be anything?
anything at all, anything at all. And in fact, what we thought of by the end of the project is that what would be really great is if you have blank shells there, because that opens up, you know, like these blank square in Scrabble, opens up a whole new opportunity for things to happen. So we've been thinking about that just before we finish. And so we've got a little example here. And I just want you to have a look as she's talking. So this is, she's one of the more professional storytellers. And incidentally, who was with there, loved storytelling. And when we approached her mum about doing the project, she said, yes, please have her. She just tells stories all the time. She can talk to you about stories instead. Tells them all the time. Is also one of those really big storytellers. So she picks up a few shells. But what I want you to look at is the pauses and also how those shells are used when she's telling the story. And also then the teacher prompts. Think about what the teachers do as well there.
There was a pirate there, and her name was Ruby.
Ruby? That's a cool name for a pirate girl.
Okay. And she was swimming in the sea.
And then what happened to her?
And then she turned into a mermaid. And then she saw fishes and her swimming and her mermaid daddy and her sister and her brother and sister.
Were they all mermaids now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they were going up in the sea.
Up to the top?
Yeah.
Okay.
And they were having presents.
Wait, that's the bit.
And a pirate came.
Oh.
And then he was chasing them. And then a giraffe ate him. And then they said, and then they had treasure.
Oh, yay.
and then that's the end.
That's the end. Wow. That had a good ending, didn't it? Does it?
Okay, so what we're particularly interested in then in conversation analysis is the way that the talk actually matches with the action of what the child is doing. And so there you can really clearly see how the shells are selected within the structure of that storytelling and how that can actually support the storytelling. But also the pauses were left for a little while, and then the teacher stands in and steps in and does the prompt. Did you notice anything else?
Changing rhythm.
Yeah, yeah. So that's something else that we look at as well in there. And so what happened before that, and then what happened after that, and what's the significance of that? Anything else? Did you notice that? So that's something significant as a space holder. Nobody interrupted and nobody stepped in to talk while she was doing that. And it's like, yeah. So just the very small details of things we look at in conversation analysis method, and we would absolutely document that she was doing that with a action. And then also looking at Gunna's pentand of storytelling, we can see that she's actually doing all of these things, but we wanted to put humour in as well, because the giraffe eating the pirate was quite significant, I think. And because it's a social process, because it's a collaborative achievement story, did you see the responses from the audience too? So the heightened amusement or something, that sort of spurred her on. We look at gaze, we look at where she's looking at and what sort of prompt that gives. So when she was looking at the little girl down there, she would laugh and do this kind of thing. So it really is this co-construction of the storytelling. And we can only really get to that by documenting the really, really fine detail of the interaction. And we look at the object affordances as well. So we see how the shells, and there's a linear process that I'm talking about. We see how they help prompt the storyline by adding shells. And they're used in systematic ways, like you're saying about the rhythm and things like that. And a visual representation of what they're going to tell. Different objects and resources enable different stories. And there's been a little bit that's written about the accomplishment of telling, so the collaboration of them. And particularly Candy Goodwin, where she talks about emotions in embodied response, and we really saw that in the responses of the audience there. Recipient design tellings as well, so something that's going to be interesting to the audience. So that's always put into storytelling as well. So finishing on 2 slides, implications for teaching around the affordances of open-ended resources. So things like shells, and like we were saying about perhaps the blank shell, that would be a really open-ended resource. How you put that into your storyline would be interesting. Play-Doh, we had some lovely storying around Play-Doh as well, because that's a completely open-ended resource, and they're moulding different creatures, telling a story about the creature as well. And particularly in a group setting, that worked really, really well. But also supporting that disposition to learn, so the emotional height of the story, so when they're really laughing, they're really getting into it, that emotion actually helps them remember that process and encourages them to do more of that storytelling in the future. And that the opportunities learn social rules around turn taking, so yeah, one's quiet, one's talking, that sort of thing. Okay. Effective stance, emotional regulation. So finally, learning stories highlight children as competent, capable learners as well. So documentation actually works within that whole philosophy of early childhood that they have in New Zealand, and long may it continue, and hopefully nothing else takes over from now. And the research method conversation analysis, which I absolutely love because I think it really reveals so many details about interactions, can also show you children's competencies as it documents their voice. So we hear where they are in that interaction and the importance of their voice. If it's taken up, if it isn't, then perhaps you can work on that, those sorts of things. It can really expose that. and the affordances of the open-ended objects, as we just talked about, and learning social rules. Yeah, and so these early learning experiences can then be documented in learning stories. So it is this full cycle of learning and progressing. And that's all. Thank you very much. So thank you for you, and thank you to the teachers.